Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar, The Quality of Light, presented by Brad Schiller. My name is Laura Lawrence and I'm the Global Marketing Director at Harman. So just a few things before we get started. Everyone on the call is muted to keep down noise levels during the webinar. However, there is a Q&A function where you can submit questions and Brad will try to answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and the link will be made available a few days after the presentation. We do have a number of other webinars taking place over the next few months for audio, lighting, video, and control, and we'd like to encourage you to take a look at the different webinars in our Learning Sessions Workshop series on pro.harman.com. We're adding new sessions daily, and we have over 25 sessions scheduled for July and August, so watch for those on the calendar. And now I'd like to introduce you to my colleague Brad Schiller, the presenter for today's webinar. Brad has been involved in automated lighting for over 30 years and is currently a business development manager at Martin Professional. He is the author of the Automated Lighting Programmer's Handbook and a regular columnist for PLSN. A self-described lighting geek, Brad enjoys sharing knowledge with others. Now I'll pass it over to you, Brad.
Thank you, Laura, and thank all of you for joining today. I'm really excited to present this learning session to you. It's something that's really important to me, and hopefully it's very important to you as well. We're going to be talking about the quality of light because there's so many different choices we have in lighting fixtures for the stage that it's hard to know what's really the best, and we're going to talk about that today. So first of all, when we talk about quality of light, what we're talking about is white light output. So when you've got a fixture that you're lighting somebody's face, you're lighting a set, you're lighting costumes, maybe you're lighting a corporate piece of product or something, you want the best quality light output from a fixture that you can get. And unfortunately, not all products are the same. Some of them look wrong on camera, some of them look wrong to the eye. And so today we're going to be talking all about judging the quality of light when we're talking about white light on different subjects. And there's very specific things that you need to understand to know and metrics to look at to compare. And some of these you can find on spec sheets, and some of them are just things you have to test with the lights themselves. But here's the main points that I'm going to go through today. We're going to talk specifically about LEDs because our industry has already transitioned over to LEDs and most of the products out there are LED based. Now there are still some that you might use that are incandescent or arc source, but primarily we're going to be talking about LEDs today. We're also going to talk about color temperature, the output field, color spectrum, which is very, very important, and color rendering. And then at the end, I'm going to wrap it all up with some resources where you can dive in and learn more. Because I'm going to give you some basic knowledge and info about these different subjects, but if you really want to go in depth, I'm going to give you resources to find that information later on. So first of all, first thing before I really dive in is throughout the presentation, I'm going to be talking about the visible light spectrum. So it's important that you're familiar at least a little bit with the visible light spectrum. And what that is if you think of sunlight, sunlight has lots of many colors within it. You can see it in the rainbow. That's what we see. It breaks down into wavelengths of light, and the wavelengths have to do with how long or short the length of the wave is that produces the light. And when you combine them all together, we get the visible spectrum part. We get the what we call visible spectrum or white light. If you're deficient in some of those, then the white light is not as pure as it could be compared to the sun. So visible spectrum is really, really important. And there's some other resources about this that you can look at another time, and they're really cool. One of them is actually from Craig Rutherford from another Martin Learning series called Color Theory for Concert Lighting Design. And in this, he talks a little bit about how our eyes actually respond to light with our cones and rods and how you can see the visible spectrum. So that's really a cool thing, and you can find that on the Martin website. You can download that or click to view it. And Craig talks all great things about color and color theory. Also, there's a really exciting video that's available called Limits of Light. It's a documentary, it's about 1 hour long, and it's on Amazon Video, Amazon Prime Video, or on YouTube, you can find it as well. And this video will go through and explain to you really, really in-depth information about wavelengths of light and how the different pigments work and how light works. And it's really a wonderful documentary. So if you're interested in visible spectrum or just lighting in general, I highly recommend checking out both of these two resources. All right, so diving in a little bit more. First thing I want to do is I want to talk about light and how it's actually produced. And you're probably familiar with incandescent lamps or light bulbs, And the way that those work is there's a tungsten wire. It goes in between two electrodes, and you apply electricity, and that tungsten wire heats up, and it generates photons of light, and those that are emitted out, and that's how we see light. Also, there's arc light sources. Arc light sources make use of two arcs and a lot of different gases that are contained in a bubble of glass. And as those two electrons or as electrons pass through, an arc is created between those 2 points, and that arc creates through the gases this big electrical charge that produces photons of light, and then you get to see light output from those. And then lastly, there's LEDs. LEDs are little chips, generally are on circuit boards. And most people are not really familiar with how do LEDs produce photons of light. And it's pretty interesting, and it's very, very important because it has a lot to do with the quality of the light that is produced. With that incandescent bulb, pretty much the tungsten wire would put out a nice visible spectrum when you heated that up. With the arc source, what would happen is you would heat up the arc source, and depending on the chemicals within that lamp, it would produce different wavelengths of light. And they got pretty good at making those to have a nice spectrum to them. But with LEDs, it's very different. So first off, I'd like to explain to you in a very basic way how LEDs actually produce photons of light, because I think it's very fascinating. So here I've got a little drawing of the inside of an LED chip. Now what you see on the left side of your screen there, that's the Martin atomic LED strobe. I'm sorry, atomic dot, wrong name there. The video atomic dot, and I've taken the lens off there in that photo, and you can see there's a ring of LEDs that are around the main LED, and those rings are actually combined of RGB LEDs with 3 chips each, a red, a green, and a blue. And what I'm showing you in the center of the screen here is actually how one of those little chips function. So deep inside there, when they produce an LED chip, the LED chip itself is very much like a computer chip. It's a silicon type of chip that actually has a lot other chemicals in it than just silicon. But if you think of a computer chip, it's like a computer chip. The difference is it produces photons of light. And the way they produce these chips is with a lot of different chemicals. They build what is called the sandwich. As you see on the screen here, the blue, the gray, and the yellow, it's kind of like a sandwich. So they sandwich together these 3 layers that they put together, and the layers are made up of different type of chemical compounds. There's all different chemicals from gallium to arsenic to nitrates. There's many different chemicals that could be mixed in there, and then the different layers have different chemicals. And then those are all sealed up together, and they're not liquid. It's a very complex system of how they produce these. And what it does is when you apply the electricity to the LED, the electrons will move from the bottom layer, what's called the N-type layer, through a junction in between the 2 layers and into the P-type layer. And as those electrons move, they fall into holes that are inside the P-type layer. And what happens when they fall in the hole is they kind of go wee and jump into that hole. And when they let out that wee sound, those electrons will actually produce a little photon of light. And that little photon of light will be emitted through the LED. So this is what happens. Again, depending on the mix of chemicals inside the wafer chip or the LED chip itself, those mix of chemicals will determine the wavelength of light that is produced from the LED chip. So it might be a red LED, a green LED, a blue LED, various other wavelengths of LED, maybe a UV LED. That's all determined, again, by the chemical compounds that go into the making of the LED chip itself. Now, one other interesting thing is these photons of light actually emit from all directions of that LED chip. They don't just come out the way we want, straight out the front. They go in all directions. And in fact, some of those photons stay within the layers. They stay within the chip itself and never actually come out. We all like to say that LEDs are super efficient, and they are compared to many other sources. However, they're nowhere near as efficient as they should be because a lot of that light is trapped even within the LED chip itself. And actually, that's what produces heat. But that light that's trapped in there, we're trying, or engineers are trying, to figure out how to get more light out of the chip itself. And the way they do this is they actually shape it. So even though I've shown it here with a rectangle, they will shape the chemicals deep inside there when they're building this sandwich in many different ways. And they'll use different things like sapphire, diamonds, and different, not diamonds, but sapphires that are shaped into a diamond type shape, and place them around and inside there and do many different things to shape the output to try to get the photons to bounce around and bounce out the direction they want. And that's how come LEDs are also becoming more and more efficient as time goes on, because very smart people are figuring out how to better shape the insides of these chips so that the photons of light come out the way we want. So that's basically how LEDs produce colored light. Again, it pretty much will produce a wavelength or range of wavelength of light. So in this case, it's a red chip, you get red light out of it. A green chip, you get green light out of it. You're not getting white. There is no actual white LED chip. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But when we have colored chips, what happens is you, again, are getting a range of LED of color out of that. So here I'm talking about a red one you see. If I had a blue chip, you would get blue LEDs out or blue wavelengths out of that LED. But it's very hard for these LED manufacturers to be consistent. It's very tough to make 1,000 chips that all are producing 450 nanometers of blue. So what do? Well, when a company like Martin or other companies are purchasing LEDs from the LED factory, there's a process called binning. And binning is you order blue LEDs. So let's say we want to order 450 nanometers, which is in the blue wavelength. We could order that, and as you see on the screen, that would be in a little bucket or a bin of blue. And you pay for how exacting to that wavelength that you want. That's why it's called binning. Think about that they put all the blue LEDs in a big bin, and some of them are 450 nanometers, some of them are 400 nanometers, some are 460. It just ranges in what type of exact blue it is. And you've probably seen this if you make use of a stage light from an inexpensive source, that stage light that might try to be saving money on their LEDs to offer you a lower priced product. Maybe you get 6, 4, 8 of them put together and you put them all in their blue, and guess what? The blues don't match. That's because they paid for a wide bin. Kind of like what you see here. They paid for just that little cart there of blues, and then they get a whole range of blues in that circle. However, when you're buying LEDs, you can pay for a tight bin, and you can say, I want LEDs that are really close to what I'm looking for. I want 450 nanometers of blue, and they'll give you ones that are just within 450, 451, 449. You pay a lot of money for that, and thus your product might cost more. But as a designer or a rental company, when you turn on that light and you see it on stage and you turn on 20 of them, all those blues are going to match. So when you're selecting fixtures to use on your stage shows, it's very important that you think about, you might not know, but to understand that the manufacturer, what type of binning are they doing for their LEDs. Now, most of the manufacturers, the top manufacturers are in industry, such as Martin. We choose very narrow binning. We pay extra money to make sure that our LEDs match from product to product and within all the different products, versions of that same product. So if you buy a quantum profile and it's got, I shouldn't say quantum profile because that's a white LED, but let's say you get a quantum wash that has RGBW LEDs in it, those blues are going to match across the entire range. So if you buy some from today and some from next week, or you get some from one rental company and some from another, put them all in blue, they should match because we've selected a very tight binning. However, some other manufacturers, maybe lower cost manufacturers, try to lower their cost of their product by choosing a wider bin. So again, it's very important to understand the price of your product might vary because of the way that they've chosen the binning and the results of that. So that's about colored LEDs in the binning. There's also something called banding, and this is also very important. That is, how wide do you allow not just the bin of the colors matching, but how many other wavelengths are included. So here is a inexpensive, non-Martin, non-major brand LED color mixing light. I won't say what country it's from, but who knows. At any rate, and it's got narrow banding. And what that means is it's got red, green, and blue LEDs in it, but they've only paid for it to be very narrow. So the blue you can see is just around 450, maybe down a little ways above and below 450, and then the green and the red. So what's going to happen when you color mix? Well, you're going to miss a lot of the spectrum. Maybe you mix the blue and the green together to create a nice cyan color, but guess what? It's not really there. You don't have the spectrum in the chips themselves to output those colors. So your color mixing is going to be poor, your color rendering is going to be awful. It's not going to be a very nice light for color mixing. However, if you do high banding or wide banding of your LEDs, when you order them, when we order them at Martin or others, when we do that, order wideband. So we will order a 450 nanometer LED that's a blue, but we order it with a wide band in the direction going towards the visible spectrum. And as you can see there, that gives us a little more of the cyans and the greens. The green is a wide band that covers into the cyans and the ambers. And by doing that, we still have the tight binning to make sure that all the LEDs match from LED to LED, but with the wide banding, it improves the color mixing. So as you can see with these two charts here, it's pretty obvious what fixture is going to color mix better, the one with the wider banding. So again, it's very important that manufacturers think about this when purchasing LEDs, to purchase LEDs that have a wide band if you're color mixing. However, there are times when you want narrow banding. If you're purchasing a UV fixture that is something down in the 400 or even lower nanometers to be ultraviolet light, you don't want it to have lots of other wavelengths in it. You want it just to be that UV light. So there are times, or maybe if you're making a stoplight or if you're making a specific piece for a set that is built in and you want it to be that one red color, well, yeah, then maybe you need a narrow band LED. But for our industry, most of them, we want the wide band LEDs, which goes back to the mix of the colors or the chemicals inside that LED and what it's going to make. And so again, that costs a little more money, and sometimes your fixtures might cost more because they have wide banding, but wide banding is very important to the quality of your lighting fixture. So that was talking about LEDs that produce colored light, but there's also white light. And as I mentioned earlier, LEDs only produce within a range of a certain wavelength. So how do we get white light out of the LEDs? Again, looking back at the VDO atomic dot, in the center of that, there is a center LED that's a white light LED that outputs white light. But white light LEDs don't exist. Well, they do in a manner. Typically, most white light LEDs are actually blue chip LEDs of a very narrow band specific wavelength, and then they're covered over with a phosphor, and that's why they look yellow. You can even see it in the photograph there that it has a yellow tint over the front of it, because that's a phosphor. And a phosphor will react to that blue wavelength that comes out of the LED chip and actually convert it into other wavelengths of light. And it'll convert red, yellow, and green and allow the blue wavelengths to pass through. So that's how we end up getting white light, by combining those. And the phosphor, again, is a mix that has to be purchased and needs to be consistent, similar to the way that LED chips need to be consistent. But the phosphor is a mix of chemicals put together, and kind of like a fluorescent light, when it sees the blue light, it glows. And when it glows, it gives off different wavelengths of light. So what we then do is the LED manufacturer then puts a lens over the top of that that culminates and combines all those different wavelengths, the red, the yellow, the green, and the blue, together into white light. And then beyond that white light goes into the optics of the actual fixture itself. So this is how most white light LED chips are made. And it's interesting because what happens is you get a lot of blue. So you get a lot of blue coming through because that's the base of it, is that blue chip. That's why people are concerned about your monitors on your televisions or your computers or your phones, that you're looking at blue blue light all the time, because there's a lot of blue wavelength in that white light. In our stage fixtures, it's important to have something that has a great mix of phosphors that gives you the most wavelengths of other things besides blue that you can get, because ultimately we want that perfect visible spectrum. So again, it comes down to cost, what the manufacturer's paying for in their white light LED. Are they paying for a really great spectrum, or are they getting not so great a spectrum? Now, you can't always find out that just by asking the manufacturer, what kind of phosphors do you use? I don't even know what those chemicals are in the phosphors, but you can find out using a light meter, which we'll talk about a little later, and using metrics like color rendering. So again, this is how white light's produced. Some people actually use not blue LEDs anymore. Some of them are moving to purple LEDs that actually help with different phosphors to produce a better visible spectrum. And then I just recently, 2 weeks ago, came across this article that was published in a LED's website that was really cool and encouraging. And that is that they're coming up with a new way to do a phosphor-free white LED. And this is exciting because this means that they've actually come up with a chemical mix to put into that sandwich of the LED to create white light. And that's unheard of, and it's amazing, and it's going to change our industry and lots of industries related to LEDs. And that's at the early stages. Right now, it has a horrible visible spectrum. You would not want to use it to illuminate anything. It's great to use as an indicator light or as some sort of awful work light somewhere maybe. But as far as actually illuminating people or sets or anything, it's not there yet. But it's encouraging because they're getting there. And soon, maybe in the next 5-6 years, we will have LEDs that actually produce white light with a great visible spectrum. So that's very encouraging. The other thing that it talked about in this article is that they've found a way to better shape within the LED to get the light output to be more narrow, to come out at a narrow beam angle. Because right now, most LEDs come out at a very wide beam angle, which puts a lot of work on optical engineers when they design the products to make that light fit within the zoom ranges that we all want to work with. It's also why you're not seeing a whole lot of LED products that work down to those like narrow 0 or 1 degree beam angles with a lot of output, because they start with this wide output from the LED and we're having to optically bring it down and we're losing a lot of output. So it's encouraging that they found a way now to get narrower output from LEDs. And again, that's in its infancy, but I think in the next couple of years, we're going to see that happening, which is very, very exciting because we're going to see a lot better output out of LED-based products, and we'll get those really narrow beams and hopefully lots of cool innovation coming. So again, there's good things on the horizon, but the white light LEDs, it's really important that we look back into the spectrum. So all that said about how white light LED is created, where we're at today, this is the Encore Encore Performance Cold from Martin, and its output is really nice. I've kind of mapped it out there over the visible spectrum, and you can see it covers pretty much a good range of the visible spectrum. So if you're using that fixture to light something on the stage, it's pretty good. It's got a good range of blues and reds and greens. It has a little lower dip down there in the cyans, and it's got more blue because it's cold engine, so it's a higher color temperature. As you'll see later, we'll look at the warm unit that actually has more red to it than the blue, as you would expect. But in the future coming soon to everyone, everywhere, there will be improved white light LED engines. And they're there now. They're just very expensive, and you're not seeing them. But you will see them in the future coming to our industry. And they will get to a point where they have a great visible spectrum. It might look something like you see here, where suddenly it's covering the full range. And that's going to be excellent, so that when you're lighting people, you're lighting set pieces, you're lighting costumes, it'll be like almost having sunlight. It'll have such a great visible spectrum. And it's going to be a really exciting time when those finally hit the market and are in use. So again, wrapping up on the LED section, LEDs are really important just to understand not every LED fixture is the same. Just because two manufacturers have two white light LEDs that maybe claim the same output, you need to look closer into and understand a little bit about the visible spectrum coming out of that. And we'll talk about color rendering metrics to measure that at the end of this presentation. However, hopefully you have an insight now into how LEDs are made and how they produce light, and how that can have a significant difference on what that white light is coming out of the front of the fixture. All right, so I'm going to move on now and talk about color temperature. Color temperature is a really cool thing that we talk about often. It's very important in many terms, but especially if you're working in a televised arena, or you're working in streaming like we are now, anything like that. Color temperature is very important working with the camera, but it's also important just generally working with light. And this really cool guy there that's on the corner of the screen, his name is Lord Kelvin. Yes, he was actually a lord, and he lived a long, long time ago. And he was sitting around one day, because he didn't have the internet or anything. So he was sitting around one day, and he had this little bar of iron, and he threw it in his fire, and he watched it heat up. And as it heated up, he saw it changed colors. It changed from this reddish, amberish color all the way to a kind of almost a pure white light, into a blue, and then even deeper blue, and he was fascinated that as it got hotter, it changed colors. And Kelvin did a lot of cool things, and he had a lot to do with measuring many different things and creating temperature scales and all. And so he started really mapping that out. He wrote it all out and measured the fire, and that came up with what we now refer to today as the Kelvin color temperature scale. And basically what it lays out to is somewhere around 3,000 Kelvin is where incandescent light actually falls. It's kind of a warmish, and you go lower than that, you get even warmer. Around 5,000, 6,000 is typically thought of being like a daylightish feel. And then you go above that, you can get into 10, 11,000 Kelvin, which is more of a bluish feel. Now, it's all white light, and you really wouldn't see the difference. If you look at something that's lit completely in 3,000 Kelvin, it's going to look white to you. But if you suddenly turn on a light that is 9,000 Kelvin, it's going to look blue compared to that lower color temperature of 3,000 that your eyes were adjusted to. And color temperature can have a lot of great things. It can make lights look brighter than other fixtures. So a higher color temperature fixture will look brighter to the human eye than a lower color temperature fixture. And that's just the nature of our eyes and our minds. So you can use that in your lighting design as a tool to actually use color temperature as a tool. So for example, if you need that light of God to shine down on someone during a show, you could light the stage in a lower color temperature, say 3,000, 4,000 Kelvin. And then when you turn on that light of God, adjust it to a really high color temperature, maybe 8 or 9 or 10,000 Kelvin, and it's going to have this really bright look to it to the human eyes that are watching your show. It's going to have a little bluish tint to it, but it's also going to appear brighter. And so those tricks like that can be used in your designs. But again, Kelvin came up with this chart, and what I want to tell you, sorry, I got a little distracted there. Back when he did this with the little piece of iron in the fire. Well, that was cool, but that wasn't really a great way to track this. And so as times developed and people got a little more oriented in things, some physicists came up with a theory that they call a black body. And a black body is not a real object, it's just a thing that they describe that doesn't actually emit any light of its own, and it doesn't actually reflect any light. But if you heat it up, you can actually measure exactly the wavelengths of light that it will emit if it's heated up. And so by doing that, they're able to actually track the wavelengths of light that equal these different colors that you see on this chart. So if we're at 3,000 Kelvin, how can we really tell what is truly 3,000 Kelvin? Well, we can tell that through the color spectrum of the color temperature. So they've done that with what they call, again, the black body curve. They took the relative information and they mapped it out onto a CIE chart. So that's what we call the black body curve. If you could see my cursor there, it's a curve that's mapped out on this chart that relates back to the visible spectrum, and we can actually look at what wavelengths of light make up 6,000 Kelvin. So for example, right here we can see in the middle, 6,000 Kelvin is that color. It's kind of a higher color temperature. On the other page, we can see the lower color temperature. 3,000 Kelvin is much lower down on the curve, and it's kind of in this browner color versus the bluer color of the higher color temperature. And the measurement of that is very, very important because it tells us the quality of the white light output. How well is it achieving its proper wavelengths for its color temperature? So for example, here we're looking at the MAC Encore Cold on the left side of your screen, and you see that the little plus sign is showing that its color temperature is at 6,000 K, and it's really close to the line. And the difference, how far off it is from that line, we measure that, and it's called the delta UV. And you can see down in the corner here, it's listed the delta UV is 0.0003, which means it's really close to the line. Now, if it was far off of the line, then it might be 6,000 Kelvin, but it might look a little pink if it's off in that direction. Or it could be 6,000 Kelvin above, and it could be up there in the greenish color. Perhaps you've used a moving light in the past that has a high color temperature by default, say 6,000 Kelvin, and you put in its CTO filter to bring it down to 3,000 Kelvin. And maybe you noticed that that 3,000 Kelvin didn't look like an incandescent light. Maybe it looked a little more amberish, or not even amber, more pinkish tint to it. I'm sure you've seen that. We've all seen that. There's many CTO filters that bring in a pink. And that's because they're actually hitting 3,000 Kelvin, but down in this range. So the wavelengths of light that are taking it to 3,000 Kelvin are off of the black body curve, and they're down in this lower range. Or they could be in a higher range, and it could look greener. So what you want to do when comparing a white light source, if they tell you that their fixture is 6,000 Kelvin or 3,000 Kelvin, you want to know what is the delta UV. How close is it to being on the perfect black body curve, the perfect wavelengths of light to make that perfect color temperature? And again, you do that by finding out the delta UV. If it's a positive number, that means it's above the curve. If it's a negative number, it's below the curve. And the closest to zero, the better. So if you find a white light fixture that claims it's 6,000 Kelvin, but its delta UV is 2.2, well, then it's going to look green. It's going to be way up here in the greens, and its white light is going to have a little greenish tint to it. Now, if you're only lighting the stage with all those lights, you might not notice that. But the minute you turn on another fixture that has a different color temperature or a better wavelength in its color temperature, better fits the black body curve, then guess what? You're going to suddenly see these lights as being green. If you're using television cameras or streaming cameras, or people are shooting it on their phones, it might have a little greenish tint to it because of that. So again, it's very important to understand how the color temperature, and most importantly, the black body curve and its metric, the delta UV, relate to your light source. And you can usually find that information and that data in the photometrics, but you can also find it through use of your light meter if you have a light meter that measures the color. The next thing that you need to look at when comparing fixtures for the quality is the beam distribution. And by this I mean does it have a flat, even field or not? And how is the light output actually distributed? Because a fixture could claim to have great output and be 30,000 lumens of output, but if that is not distributed correctly throughout the beam, it could really negatively affect your show. So for example, here there's 3 different beam distributions I'm showing on the screen. The center one is a perfectly flat, even output. Really nice, the light spread all the way across. You have the same amount of light in the center as you do on the outside. If you're projecting that to light a person or to light a piece of scenery, the light will be nice and even all the way across. There's no fall off. It's really beautiful. And that's where a lot of LED products are heading to today. However, there are some that don't fit that. There are, say on the left, there's one there that we don't see a whole lot anymore, but it has a dark spot in the center. And that dark spot could come and used to come from when we had lamps, and the lamp would be in a reflector, and you would have to move the lamp in and out between that reflector to get it perfectly aligned. And if it wasn't aligned, you might have a dark spot in the middle. And obviously that's not good, because you pointed at someone and it's dark on their face and bright around them. That's no good. So you don't want something that's dark like that. Sometimes that can also happen through the use of zooming. You might zoom a fixture out to its widest or its narrowest, and you might see differences in the beam distribution. And maybe there's a point there that, because of the way the zoom works and the optical system, that it goes dark in the center or not as bright in the center as it was when it's perfectly flat, even field. So it's important to look at these things because it's going to have a big impact on how you're illuminating your scenes and your people. And then finally, on the right side, you see that there's a hot spot. And the hot spot, you might notice in a lot of beam type fixtures, which is great. We want that when you're doing beamage in the air and beams flying around, because the eye is drawn to that tight, narrow beam in the center. That's great. But when you're lighting people and places and things, you don't want that, because again, all the light's going to be concentrated in the center and it might be bright, but as soon as the person moves left or right, the light falls down on them and they don't look as nice. And so you want to try to avoid that. But I'm going to put a little note on there. There are some designers who prefer a little bit of a hot spot, because what they like to do is create a wash and do a lot of overlapping. And the hot spot actually helps, because with the overlapping, if you line it up correctly, all the hot spots work well. And then where the 2 fall-offs are in the center, that's where you overlap those 2 lower points. And if it's a nice ratio, it will even out all the way across. So you have 2 fixtures side by side, overlap their not as bright areas, and now you'll have a brightness all the way across. Doesn't always work out that way, and it depends on how bright that center spot is compared to the others. But again, these are all things you need to look at when comparing fixtures side by side and determine what's best for your use and your need. Typically, most people prefer the flat, even field for their beam distribution. You can find out this information, and this is a really great little test to kind of show you a reality of it. On the top of the screen here, I'm showing you the Mac Viper performance. And the Mac Viper has listed at 26,000 lumens, a beam angle of 44 degrees at its widest. And it actually measures out at 33 feet away, 76-foot candles. But we look below, I have the Mac Axiom Hybrid there. Its widest beam angle is 42, so it's pretty close. It's only 15,000 lumens, so almost half the amount of lumen output, but it's 197 foot candles, more than double that at 33 feet. You might think, wow, that's the choice I need to look really bright on my stage. Maybe, if you're doing beams and things. However, if you're illuminating a person, a face, or even putting in a gobo and doing a wash on a wall, you're going to see a really bright hot spot, as you can tell in that beam distribution for the axiom. You can see there that it's the center part gray. That's the brightest part compared to the Viper that's very even all the way across its field. So it makes a big difference to understand the purpose of what you're using your light for and what that beam distribution is. The axiom's not a bad light because of having this narrow hotspot. It's great. It's really wonderful for doing beams in the air and for doing some gobo projections here and there. But if you're really primarily trying to look for the quality to illuminate people and sets and things, well, then you probably really want something that has a better beam distribution that's more even all the way across, spreading out that 26,000 lumens all the way across. So that if somebody's moving around, they're evenly lit at 76 foot candles from the Viper versus being really bright in the center of the axiom and then falling off from there. So again, you can look at beam distributions like this to really get the idea. Now the axiom also has a beam flattener in it that you can make use of. You can put that in and it drops the foot candles down to be almost in the range of the Viper. However, if you look at the chart there, again, it's widened out that hotspot, but it's still not anywhere close to what the Viper is for its beam distribution. So beam distribution is a really great thing to look at when you're comparing your fixtures. Excuse me. All right, so we're going to move on now and talk a little bit more about color spectrum. As I've said, this is a very important thing to look at when we're talking the quality of light, and particularly white light, because white light is made up of the spectrum it's made up of. And if it doesn't have everything in it, then it's not great white light. So first of all, let's look at daylight. Daylight is the ultimate gold standard thing that we all compare and know. That's what our eyes have been developed to see. So it, of course, has all of the visible spectrum in it. So all of the spectrum is there. It's what we want to try to achieve. With incandescent light, it had a lot of red in it, but it also was full spectrum. It had everything there. It looked great. You could use daylight or incandescent light to light people, places, and things, and they're going to look wonderful. However, if we look at something like fluorescent, pretty much we all know fluorescent light is horrible and not something we want to use on stage or to illuminate people. There are some professional film fluorescents that have been designed with really high quality spectrum, but your everyday average fluorescents are no good. And a really good example is, let's say you go into a store and you purchase a red shirt and you look at it in the store and you go, yeah, okay, it's got some red in it, but it really doesn't do much for me. It's kind of muted, and I like that. I don't want a lot of red. And it has the spectrum as shown here. It's green and yellow is spiking, but there's not much red in the store, so it doesn't look like it's super red. Then you walk outside in the sunlight and you go, whoa, this shirt's got all this red all over it, and it's really bright red. Why is it so different? Well, that's because when you viewed it in the store, the lights that were illuminating it didn't have much red spectrum in the light itself to actually put red light on it for you to see. So it's very important when you're lighting the stage that you look for a fixture that is as close to full spectrum as possible. That's what you're looking for in your high quality products to illuminate, again, faces and set pieces and costumes and everything else. When we had halogen lights, they were pretty good. They were a little deficient in the blue. And then there's just some examples here of some general cool white and warm white LEDs that are not very good in this sense, that show you, again, let's say that warm white LEDs really got a lot of green and yellow in it and not a whole lot of red or blue. So that would be deficient and cause problems. And you would see problems if you used that warm white LED and you illuminated your show. And let's say the costume designer had done all these great blues and things, and he had done that in a lab, and he saw his colors with a really nice light. And then on stage, you light it with that warm white LED, and you say, oh yeah, I have a low color temperature. It's going to look beautiful. Guess what? Those blues are not going to look the same way with that particular product because the fixture just doesn't have the wavelengths in it. So it's really important that you try to find a fixture that has a full spectrum, as full as possible. Here's some examples, again, back to the Mac Encore Performance. The fixture itself comes in two different models, cold and warm. And here you can see these are nearly full spectrum fixtures. We have designed the white light LEDs. We've purchased white light LEDs that come with the near full spectrum so that we're giving you the highest quality possible on stage so that colors, when you light, again, faces and sets and costumes, they all look very good, very natural, as they should appear. And you can see, as you would expect, the cold unit has a little more blue in it to get that higher color temperature, and the warm unit has a lot more red in it to get that warmer color temperature. Of course, you can adjust these through your color mixing or through various other flags that are in the fixture, but the raw output from that white source is a beautiful, nearly full spectrum colors to it. As an example too, I got this chart here that I just brought into the screen that is a fixture from a competitor that actually doesn't use a white light chip. It uses red, green, and blue chips to mix together to create white. And here you can see the spectrum is not that great. It's spiky in the red and blues. And if you want to try to get into those cyans and those ambers, you're going to have a tough time because it just doesn't have those wavelengths. So although they say they have a white light source that can mix with red, green, and blue LEDs, it's going to be deficient. So it's very important that you understand the color spectrum that is being produced from the white lights in your LEDs. So moving on, we're going to talk about color rendering. Color rendering is a big topic these days. A lot of people talk about something that you've probably heard called CRI, and we're going to talk about why that's no good in just a few minutes. But color rendering, why is it important? What is it? Well, first of all, here's my favorite thing. I love chocolate. I like a lot of really good chocolate. M&Ms aren't the best, but they are pretty good, and they're colorful. So they're a good example here. So with color rendering, if I took my M&Ms there and I illuminate it from two different light sources, one on the left and one on the right, you could probably see which one has the better color rendering. The one on the left is a full spectrum light source that has really good color rendering. The one on the right is a fixture that, well, that fixture didn't quite have as much of a great color spectrum to it, and its color rendering is poorer. What color rendering means is when you shine a white light onto a subject, and it's a multicolored subject, how are those colors going to render under that light? How are they going to look? Are you going to see the red in the true vivid red that it looks like? Or is it going to be a muted red? Is the blue going to be nice, or is it going to be missing out? And that all relates back to the color spectrum of the light source. But we can't tell that until you actually shine the light on a face or a costume or on something. So what do? Well, we have to rely on metrics. And there's several different metrics that we use to determine the color rendering of a lighting source. Before we go into those and what they are and why you would use some over the others, it's important to understand how they all work. So no matter what the color rendering metric is, whether it's CRI, TM30, TLCI, or any of the others, they all work in the same basic manner. They take a series of color chips, predetermined colors, as you see on the top row by the sun up here, and they say that is how those colors will render from a known subject that is full spectrum like the sun or an incandescent lamp. So if I put this card out in the sun, this is how this color should look under the sunlight. Then you take your light source that you want to compare, say some moving light, and you illuminate the same chip, and you look at how close is it to matching that known source of the sun. So if we do that, and we look, let's say here at VS3, sample 3, you can see that this lighting fixture is way off from matching how that color would look under the sunlight. So you look at that and you go, well, it's way off. So you rate that on a scale of 1 to 100. 100 means it's perfect. It perfectly matches that color. Or it's way off, it's going to get a lower score. It might get a 10 for that particular color chip. So you do that for all the different color chips, see how close or far your light source is from the known good source of the sun. And then you add them all up, all those scores 0 to 100, and you average them in some way, and you go, boom, there's my score. My score is this. Now with that score, you can compare this light to another light and say, well, if this light has a score of 99 and this light has a score of 22, I can definitively say the score of 99 is going to be better for rendering color than the score of 22. And it's very important when you're, again, lighting, I know I keep saying it, but when you're lighting people and sets and things, to have really great color rendering. If you're just doing beams in the air, it doesn't really matter so much. So again, this is how all these different color rendering metrics that we're about to speak about work, is comparing a known source to your source and how well it renders specific colors. However, Nobody actually goes outside into the sun with a trip chart and looks at it and then tries to run into their moving light and compare and see. The way that these are calculated is through the use of a light meter. So typically people will use some sort of light meter or color meter that gives them the color spectrum of the fixture, and that can actually go in and determine the color rendering metric. So it could be CRI or TM30, and it will just tell you this is the score for that fixture. But you have to realize not every light meter is created the same. And the way it does it, again, they're not comparing the chips. What they're comparing is the spectrum of your light source to that known light source, and how well would that spectrum actually render those colors. So it uses algorithms, and those algorithms are built by programmers who are generally smart people, but different light meters might use a slightly different algorithm. And the chip on the light meter, the sensor, might be different. So you could use one light meter versus another light meter and get a totally different CRI or TM30 score out of the different light meters. So it's important to understand that it's all based on numbers and math and things like that. It's not always just truly comparing from a chip chart. It's actually using the spectrum measured from a light meter and then algorithms to determine that. And that's very important to understand because it can be manipulated. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But that's how all these color rendering metrics function and are calculated. So what are they? Let's look at them real quick. CRI. CRI has been talked about a lot in our industry. It's a horrible metric. Everybody's talking about it. Lots of manufacturers are telling you their fixture has a CRI number of this or that. We should not be using CRI. I will tell you why in just a moment, but first let's understand what it is, and that will really tell you why it's a poor metric before I go on my soapbox. So CRI is known as the Color Rendering Index, really nice name for it, and it was developed a long, long time ago for a very specific type of fluorescent light. It was not developed for LEDs, and it really shouldn't be used for LEDs. See, I'm back on my soapbox. All right, so what is it? Well, what it does is it uses this chip chart you see here with 14 colors. Oh, wait, no, sorry. Actually, it only calculates the first 8. It was designed with the 14 chips, but the metric actually uses just the first 8 colors. Sometimes a manufacturer will tell you their R9 number, but really the normal numbering system is based on the first 8. So again, like I just said, it looks at those first 8 colors there you see, compares that to your light source to the known source, how well it would render those colors, and it gives it a score 0 to 100. Now, you notice those colors 1 through 8, there is no red, yellow, green, blue. There's just very muted colors. There's not much saturation to it, and there's not a great range of wavelengths. This is one of the inherent problems with CRI. It's only limited to those few colors. Another problem with it is the fact that it takes those scores 0 to 100 for each of those 8, it adds them up, and it just averages them. So you add them all up, you get a score of 653, divide by 8, that's your color rendering score. That means the numbers can be manipulated. How can they be manipulated? Well, you can add in different wavelengths of light and maybe have lots more wavelengths of a specific, let's say red or green or a different thing, and that would cause the algorithms to work in such a way that maybe the R4 would have a higher number and the R5 might be a little lower, but that basic average, they're all going to come out together the same and will give you a higher score. So CRI is a horrible metric, horrible metric, because it doesn't take saturation into account, it doesn't make use of most of the spectrum, and it's a basic average. Now, I keep telling you it's a horrible metric. Lots of people are counting on it and using it today, and we'll get to what you should be looking at. But I want to give you a very good example of just how bad CRI is. What I'm showing you now on your screen are 2 different images illuminated by 2 different fixtures. Each fixture is going to have a different CRI score. Which one would have the higher CRI score, the one on the left or the one on the right? Now, obviously, it depends on your monitor. You may or may not see these 2 looking the same that I see them. But in general, just to get the idea, hopefully you see the difference in your mind, or even shout out loud in your house right now. Just shout out and tell me which one you think has the higher CRI, the one on the left or the one on the right. Oh, I think I heard somebody said the one on the right. But you know what? Actually, they both have the exact same CRI score. What? How could that be? Well, that's because CRI does not take into account the red, the green, the yellow, the blue, all those great things, or saturation. So if these two could have the exact same score, these two fixtures that could look this wildly different, then how could CRI be a good metric? How could I use that to really determine how well that costume is going to look? I mean, look at that one piece in the center there, how vivid and different the colors are. If that was a costume that the costume designer created or a set that somebody created, they would be very upset if I used the fixture on the right when they were used to expecting it to look like the fixture on the left. And if CRI told me that these both have the same score, how would I know they would look so different? We need a better metric. And there is a better metric out there, TM30, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But I have one more little bit to talk about with CRI. CRI filters. There are fixtures on the market and continuing to be fixtures on the market that have CRI filters in them. It is a device you can bring into the path of the light that will increase the CRI score. Now, I just told you the CRI score really is no good. And I just gave you an example of why it can be very confusing and why you shouldn't use it. But there are CRI filters out there. It's important to understand what they're actually doing. So I took this information here. I'm not going to tell you what manufacturer. It's one of our competitors. But they publish very good information on their website and in their photometrics. And this is their actual chart from their photometrics and their actual value, that they have a CRI score of 72 and color temperature of 7,000-ish lumens and, Kelvin, and almost 38,000 lumens of output. And it's a pretty nice color spectrum they have out of it. Now, if you bring in their CRI filter into the path, it goes up to a CRI of 84. Wow, it went from 72 to 84. Wow, is that a good thing? It sounds good, sure. Well, what's it doing? Look at the spectrum. Again, this is the spectrum from their own documentation. It's taking out some green. Is it adding more colors out of the spectrum? No, it's taking out some green. They are manipulating the numbers by manipulating the wavelengths to get a higher score on paper, but it's not actually adding more wavelengths of light. So is it actually improving the look of the output of the fixture? Some people say yes, some people say no. It really gets back down to looking at a better metric, like TM30. We're getting there. Hang on one second. One more thing I want to point out, it also loses a lot of light when you bring in that, because you take out that green, which green contributes a lot to the lumen output. So you see it loses about 8,000 lumens in that point. So you bring in the CRI filter to increase your CRI score, and now you've brought your fixture down to about 30,000 lumens. So you've lost some output. One more little aside, just for a moment, bear with me, outside of CRI just for a second. This manufacturer, again, I'm not going to name who they are, but they gave me a great example to show you that you need to be careful of everything you read, because you can go to their website and you see their marketing page, and then you click on photometrics, and the photometrics give you this information I have here. That they tell you in the photometrics, the fixture's brightest output is 38,000 lumens, or 37,733. Great. But the marketing web page that you use to click on the photometrics and their advertising literature actually says providing up to 45,000 lumens. But their very own photometrics says that this fixture is 38,000-ish lumens. So I don't know where those other lumens are coming from, but this is a very good example of why you can't believe everything you read, and you need to measure for yourself or with a third party and really understand photometrics, and look always at the photometrics from the manufacturer to get the true output or a truer output than the marketing literature. So again, the literature says 45,000 lumens, but their own publication of their photometrics says 38,000. I don't know, crazy. All right, sorry about that little aside there, but I thought that was important to point out. So TM30. TM30 is very important. This is the metric of use that has been ratified, that's been accepted in our industry. It's what everyone should be using. Some people talk about TM3018, which is just a newer version that had a few changes to it. TM30, at any rate, is the color rendering metric that should be used when comparing lighting fixtures for quality white light output. TM30 is based on 99 different colors. You see here it's a broad range of mostly pastelish type colors, but that's because those go together to really determine the full spectrum all the way across many different hues. And the way this works is, again, it compares those color charts to all those chips your fixture works with, illuminates each of those chips compared to the sun, gives each one a score of 0 to 100. And then instead of just taking them and doing a normal average, it does another type of special averaging that it uses to determine, to get rid of that. It's a different type of algorithm called the root square mean method, where it uses a square root methodology to do the averaging that helps eliminate some of the fudging around of numbers that's possible, such as with CRI with this normal averaging. So what's really great about TM30 is it uses 99 different color chips, and it actually gives you two different numbers. It gives you one that has to do with the fidelity, which means how well is it rendering all these colors, and another one that has to do with the gamut that tells you how well is it in saturating all these colors, over or under saturating. And then there's a standard report that should be given and provided with the TM30. This is an example. This TM30 report here is from the Mac Encore WARM. You see the fidelity index is 89.8 and the gamut's 98.3. Closer to the 100, the closer it is to being like the sun, being perfect, or in this case, an incandescent lamp because it's a WARM. And then the gamut tells you if it's closer to 100, how well it's saturating. If it's lower than 100, it's undersaturating compared to that known source. If it's higher than 100, it's oversaturating. And then it gives you a couple other things. It gives you what's called a hue bin, where it puts it down into some basic colors of the spectrum that makes it quick and easy to look at where all those different color chips are averaging in. And then on the bottom right, it shows you a color icon that shows a circle. And in that circle, you can see if it's fully illuminating throughout that circle, you're going to get most all of the spectrum. If it's missing some, like this is missing a little bit of red, a little bit of green, you can see that quick and easily. And that makes it very easy to compare to two different fixtures, because you might compare it to another fixture that is missing a lot of the red at one end of that, and you could just look at that little circle and know right away, okay, that's why its score is a little higher or lower, because it's missing some red. And if that's important to you, then you can make your decisions based on that. The last score I want to talk about is TLCI. Now, when we talked about CRI, which I think is awful, and TM30, those have to do with color rendering for the human eye. So if you're doing a concert, a theater, a play, a corporate event, you've got people in the seats, hopefully, they're watching the show. It's their eyes that are important for those color rendering metrics. But if you're lighting for television or for camera or for streaming or any of those types of things, you want to look at the TLCI score, because this score does the same thing for color rendering, but it does it based for the camera, not for the human eye. So it uses a standard television chip chart, which looks like this. It has 18 colors plus some grayscales, but it doesn't make use of the grayscales. And it takes that chip chart, does the same comparison, and it gives you a score of 0 to 100. Again, it uses the root square mean calculation, and it gives you that average out of that. If it's 85 or higher, guess what? That light will look great on camera. You don't have to worry. If it's between 50 to 85, you might have some problems with some colors on camera, but you can make corrections. And if it's below 50, don't use this light on camera, not to illuminate people and things. For beamage, great. So TLCI is really cool. It also gives you can see on the chart there, it gives you some numbers and things you can give to your video engineer, and they can enter in the data and actually improve the video image based on the spectrum of your light and its TLCI score. So again, if you're using television, use the TLCI color metric. One last little thing back to CRI. You can tell I have a lot to tell you about CRI. I do want to say I talked about color filters. The Martin fixture, the ELP fixture, ELP color fixture, actually has a mode, two different modes, high output and high quality. And we will tell you that the high quality will increase your CRI score. Now, I don't like that, but we have it. Let me show you what that does. So here it is in the high output mode, which I highly suggest you only use high output mode. It has a CRI of 85, and you see the TM30 score and the TLCI score there as well. If I turn on the high quality mode from its user menu, what that does is it actually limits the intensity output of the amber chip, because it's a red, green, blue, amber, lime LEDs in that fixture, and it actually will limit the amber and a little bit of the green. Now, what that does for you is then we can claim that this fixture has a CRI score that increased to 90 from 85. Yay! Who cares, right? But look what's interesting. The TM30 score stayed nearly the same, and the TLCI score stayed nearly the same. That's because overall the spectrum stayed the same. This just reduced intensity and reduced the output. So it's very important to understand CRI is a horrible metric. Please don't refer to it. Please refer more often to TM30. All right, almost there. So color rendering, one more point I want to make, don't get so caught up on the numbers. If you have fixtures that have a score that are high 90s, they'll probably be very good for illuminating people's faces, set pieces, costumes, all that. If you've got a big range, you're comparing two different fixtures and one has a 90 score and one has a 91 score, or one has 89 and one has 92, they're probably all just fine. Nobody's going to know the difference. Unless you're lighting something super, super important for somebody who really is good at knowing the color or dove deep into those colors. For example, if you're lighting the new Corvette and the guy who developed and mixed the paint is going to be there to look at it at the auto show, yeah, he might see the difference between a score of 90 and 94, as you can't probably see in this drawing here. But everybody else who's there to view that Corvette, they're not going to see the difference. Now, if you looked at Corvette with a fixture that had a score of 50, yeah, they would see the difference. It would not look the right way. So don't get so caught up, no matter what color rendering metric you're using, on, oh, this light's got a 92 and that one only has a 90. I got to pick the 92. No. Understand, small differences don't make a big difference for the majority of productions out there. Big differences, yes. Small differences, no. All right, so where do you find all this information? Well, hopefully your manufacturers that you're comparing your lighting fixtures provide you that in their photometrics. I'm showing you here the photometrics from the Mac Encore, and we provide everything. We provide the color spectrum, we provide all the metrics, even CRI, which we don't like, but we know people want to compare it. Hopefully now you understand more about why it's not so great. We give you the full black body curve, the color, the TM30 scores, lots and lots of information are all there in our publications. Hopefully, if you're comparing our product to another product, that manufacturer will provide that. Not all of them do. Some of them just give you the number. Ask them to provide the data. Ask them to give you the color spectrum. If they won't, get a light meter. Meter it for yourself. See what that is. Determine it on your own. But the best is to find it through the photometrics. So when you're out there, choose wisely. You've got lots of different fixture choices out there, and they're not all the same. Just because two fixtures say that they have the same brightness and they have the same white light LED coming out of them and they're great, you really have to look at all these points I've talked about today. You need to look at the LEDs and understand that they're not all the same. A white light LED is not the same as another. One company's white light LED might not have the same spectrum or might not be built the same way as another one's. So you need to understand the LEDs in there. How well is it going to color mix? The color temperature of the fixture, is it on the black body curve or is it way off? The output field, is it flat and even or is it really hot spotty, and is that where they're getting most of their output? Again, the color spectrum is really important, and color rendering, understanding what the color rendering metrics are and how and when to use them. Again, when you're choosing, the best choice is to put the two fixtures side by side and look at them yourself and measure them. But if you can't do that, look at all the paperwork you can find and do that. One last note, the output. As I showed you, not all the outputs are the same just because one manufacturer claims to have more output than another. Lumen measurements are widely different, and you can't always tell from that either. So take the time, test, and really determine what is best with your fixtures. So I promised you where you can learn more. As I put together this presentation, I did a lot of research, various places, but particularly my friend Mike Wood. He's a very well-known person in our industry. If you go to his website, mikewoodconsulting.com, he has a whole big list of articles there. And on those articles, you'll find everything I spoke about today, how LEDs work, color rendering, why CRI is awful, many of these different topics I talked about today, beam distribution, all of that. He has very, very in-depth articles with lots of geeky information. I highly suggest you go there and check that out if you want to learn more. Also on his website, another thing he does for Light and Sound America and Light and Sound International is he produces product reviews. And he has very unbiased, very technical, detailed product reviews. So if you go there, you can also click on his website. And this is a wonderful resource to find a third-party measures and metrics of lighting fixtures. So if you're comparing our fixtures to someone else's or any fixtures, go see if he's done a review, and he will give you the color spectrum, the color output, all the metrics. He measures everything. He'll tell you how loud it is, everything he does from a totally unbiased way in a third party. Wonderful source. So check out mikewoodconsulting.com. All right, so that was a lot of information, and I thank you for staying with me and enjoying it. And hopefully you've learned a lot and you'll make better decisions going forward on the quality of light. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brad. We do have questions if you have time.
Yeah, super. I love it.
All right, wonderful. The first question is asking, as a consumer of higher end lighting fixtures, how often should I expect a major upgrade in tech?
It's a very good question. They upgrade pretty often. I mean, the LED world, the light sources themselves are updating all the time. Our industry is basically trying to not overwhelm the rental companies in particular. They don't want new light sources coming out all the time and new fixtures. But typically fixtures are designed to last, they used to be designed to last 8 to 10 years. Now it's more 5 to 8 years is the lifespan of a typical lighting fixture right now. So I would say probably around that, around 5 to 8 years. But technologies is always changing, and we're all striving to get better spectrum and better output and everything from all the products.
Okay, next question. Why do all Martin products have a very dark red when outputting? I have this issue when wanting to use a deep saturated red with Martin fixtures.
Well, red is a tough color to create, and again, it goes back to the basic light source behind that fixture. So behind that filter. So when you're color mixing to red, it depends how much red is in the source to begin with. And then it also depends how you're mixing. If you're mixing with an LED, what type of wavelengths are from that LED, or if you're mixing with a color filter, such as a dichroic color filter, is how is that filter, what wavelengths is it allowing to pass through? Why you're finding Martin lights have a dimmer red than other products, it could be because of the choices of the light source, or again, the mix of the color flags themselves. When you color mixing with dichroic filters, cyan, magenta, yellow, there's a lot of choices that have to be made, particularly in the magenta and yellow, of how saturated those will be, and that will have a big impact when you then go to mix red and how much light is allowed to pass through. So I can't tell you the exact physics of why you're seeing that, but it has to do with a lot of different qualities.
All right, next question is asking if you can recommend a resource for reviews of how well various LED sources work with different video cameras.
That's a tough one. There might be something out there, but I'm not familiar with that. Maybe some site that measures different cameras, but then I don't know if they would be measuring the LED sources. I think probably that's a test you'd have to do on your own. You would have to take a camera and take different fixtures and see them and then create that. I'm not sure that actually exists.
Okay, next question. So obviously TM30 is the preferred metric, but have you seen this metric manipulated and abused as well? What should we be aware of or look for when using this over CRI?
Yeah, TM30 can be manipulated a little bit. It's a lot harder, a lot more difficult to manipulate the numbers because of the way there's more numbers and because of the way the averaging is done, but it can. And there's actually one manufacturer, it might even be two now I've seen, that claim to have a TM30 filter. And there's one manufacturer that claims their TM30 filter will increase their CRI score, which is really confusing because they've confused two different metrics there. So it doesn't really make sense to me. But at any rate, yeah, it can be manipulated, but they're working with the TM30 and they make improvements over time so that it's more difficult. But yes, you can always figure out what the algorithms are in the light meters and figure out ways to manipulate wavelengths to adjust the score, but it's harder with TM30.
Okay, and then we had a few more questions here. What about the spectrum for non-LED sources? What is it like for lasers, plasma, and such?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's other light sources that we see come to market from time to time, lasers and plasma, like you said. And a lot of these are very narrow band right now. Lasers are very narrow band and they don't color mix well. You'll see that in fixtures that are making use of that, or they use a laser phosphor source is another thing, which is similar to the way the white light LED produces from a blue LED to have a phosphor illuminate. They use a laser with blue light to create the phosphor, to illuminate the phosphor. But the wavelengths are just not there yet. It depends again on the source, and you really need to go back and measure it to determine what that is.
Okay, next question. How often does a show actually need high quality color rendering from a stage lighting fixture?
Uh, it depends, but the majority of shows out there, the high quality color rendering, it probably doesn't make a big difference. If you're in the high 80s and above, it's probably going to be okay for the majority of your shows. You again need to look at and think of the audience. Who is the audience? If you're doing a corporate event and it's for Fashion Week, let's say, and they're showing off all the fashion, yeah, it might be more important to get those colors exactly right and try to get the higher color rendering that you can get. Not necessarily the highest, but get a high color rendering. Maybe pick something that's a little bit higher than 80. Maybe get something that's in the high 90s or somewhere. But for the majority of shows out there, for a lot of things going on, it probably isn't going to make a big difference.
Okay, next question. How do we choose if we could just read the spec sheet, which part should be the most important?
The whole thing. The entire spec sheet is important. But if you're looking at if you're speaking of photometrics, personally, I would refer back to the spectrum at this point, especially with LEDs. I would look at the spectrum because that's going to tell me what wavelengths are coming out of that light in white. Now, if it's a color mixing LED light, they'll typically give you a spectrum of their white light that's mixed from the colors.
All right, we have another question. If CRI is such a lousy measurement, why is it used on most spec sheets?
I would wonder that myself quite often. CRI has been around for a long time, like I said, and it's actually used in a lot of home products. If you go into your local Home Depot or Lowe's or somewhere, you'll find that they sometimes list on different bulbs, they'll list CRI there as well. It's just been around for a long time and people made use of it. And I'm not sure where and when it got started in our industry as a metric people were referring to. But TM30 is what took over and it is actually the better metric. As I said, hopefully we're going to continue to see CRI fall away and people more focus on TM30. And you're starting to see that if you look at the different manufacturers, everybody's giving their TM30 scores now where they weren't before. So slowly we're getting there, but it still is around.
Right, next question. What type of light meter do you use for measuring spectrum and color rendering?
Yeah, so out there's lots of different light meters. Not all of them will have color meter abilities to them. Some of them will just measure intensities and brightness. But you want to look for something that is capable of giving you all the different metrics, not just CRI. There's some really nice Sekonic light meters out there, like the one I showed in my presentation that show you a lot of information. There's some older ones that only give you CRI or don't give it at all. One that I use, I actually have it sitting on my desk. If you can see my screen here, I have this little meter here. It's a really cool one from ANSI Tech. It's called the Lighting Passport, and it uses Bluetooth to connect to your computer or to your phone or your tablet. And it is great because you can just update the app and they can give you all kinds of new updated information for everything. But it also measures and provides you lots of information. It'll give you the color spectrum. It'll give you the color temperature, the black body, delta UV. It gives you all the different metrics you could ever want, lots of stuff. But it also allows you to save that data onto your phone or your tablet and compare. So you can create your own database. You can go into a lighting shop and measure all the Martin lights, then measure all the competitors' lights and all of another. And then you have that in your own database that you can refer back to so that when you find another light on its own, you can compare to things you've already measured. So I really like that. There's also another one called Lumu, which is a little round thing that you can attach. It only works with iOS devices, but it'll plug into those, and it's a nice little button thing, and it does really well. The current issue of PLSN has a review of that product. But those three are the main ones. There's some others out there, but I really like the Lighting Passport. But I will warn you, it's very expensive.
Okay, it looks like that was the last question to come in. If you do have additional questions, Brad's contact information is up on the screen right now, and he would be happy to respond to you directly through that. I did want to mention that Brad does have 2 additional sessions that are coming up in August. On August 4th, he has From Idea to Output, the development process of a moving light. And then on August 20th, he is doing a joint session with Craig Rutherford, who is also a fantastic presenter, and that will be on conceptual design principles. So if you'd like to register for those, just visit pro.harman.com, and the full calendar of upcoming sessions is there. Brad, thank you so much for presenting, and thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate your time.
Yep, thank you everyone, and feel free to email me and I'll answer any other questions you have. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Have a great day.